Thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second core seminar of the spring semester. Just a few housekeeping notes. Please be mindful, as you just heard, hopefully the session is being recorded, so it can be accessed along with all of our prior seminars for those not able to make it today. I'm going to ask that you please mute your microphone and turn off your camera when not actively engaged in the conversation. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat, so please feel free to post any questions there, or you can use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you as time allows. Just a note that our next seminar is going to be Tuesday, April 5th, and it'll be an introduction of the Raman IR and XRF spectroscopy core with Haoshan Dai and Zili Gao. We'll put a link to the chat for the registration on that. We love feedback on these sessions, including any suggestions you might have for future topics. I'm not going to give a long spiel today. I'm going to turn over. Today's seminar is a special event hosted and coordinated by the Center for Human Health and Performance. So without any further delay, let me turn it over to the director, Dr. Mike Busa. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Andrew. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mike Busa. I direct the Center for Human Health and Performance at IELTS. And today it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Genny Beemyn. Dr. Beemyn is the director of the Stonewall Institute, a gay and lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual resource center here at UMass Amherst, and is located in Crampton Hall. They are recognized as a national leader in how to inquire about gender identity for research and administrative purposes, and have been involved in, or have principally developed, the language used by UMass on the Common Application and on the Campus Climate Survey. Dr. Beemyn completed their PhD in African American Studies and American Studies at the University of Iowa, and has authored more than half a dozen books on the lives and experiences of LGBTQ people, with an emphasis on transgender youth and college students. Before I turn it over to Dr. Beemyn, I wanted to give special thanks to Lisa Korpieski for pulling the seminar together, and Susan Shaw, Ray Walker, Nicole Van Kim, Layla Keogh, Stuart Chipkin, and Katie Colfer for their contributions in shaping the scope of this talk. And without further ado, I'll hand the call over to Dr. Beemyn.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see folks, and especially a few familiar faces. I'm going to do that screen share thing here. So give me a second. There we go. Feel free, as was mentioned, to put things in the chat, questions you might have. Also, raise hand feature if you want to do that. I'll try to get to questions as we go along. So since you're here, most of you probably recognize why this issue is important, but maybe someone was sort of pushed here by a colleague or nudged by a department chair. So let's start by talking why this is important to be talking about. There's decades of research that shows differences in experience in all aspects of society because of gender identity. So by failing to consider gender identity, you miss these differences in your research. And you may overlook confounding variables in your data by not accounting for differences of gender identity. It's also important too, because of the language that we use could be unintentionally offending or excluding trans and non-binary people, which can hurt your research in terms of making it less diverse, smaller, and less generalizable. And it could also hurt people. It could be detrimental to study participants, prospective participants from these groups who are put at harm needlessly by using language that is not appropriate, that's not inclusive. Many years ago, when I was an undergraduate and taking women's studies courses, and back then it was called women's studies, not women's and gender studies or women's gender and sexuality studies. So that tells you how long ago that was. I was taught that basically sex was biological and gender was constructed. Oh, if it was only that easy, right? Sex is also socially constructed. We can point to, for example, intersex people whose bodies are literally constructed by medical professionals. And gender is also biological. Many trans people feel that who they are is innate. To complicate sex further, oftentimes we use the expression sex assigned at birth to clarify what we mean when we say sex. Well, that doesn't include intersex individuals who typically are not assigned intersex at birth. And of course, it doesn't recognize the fact that many people don't identify as how they were assigned at birth and don't want to be known by that. And it also doesn't address the fact that how someone's sex is defined legally may have changed because they have changed the gender marker on their legal documents. And this is something that I have been trying to address. I have worked historically against and now work with the folks at the Common Application, and which is the admission form that's used by UMass and over 900 other colleges. And pushing them not to use sex, which they were using originally as a question, they then moved it to sex assigned at birth. And I pointed out to them that's really problematic because that's not necessarily how someone is legally defined. And this was particularly important back then because historically women's colleges were not admitting trans women. Now that's changed, thankfully, at most women's colleges, but back then that wasn't the case. So you had individuals who were legally female because they've been able to change their documentation, but because they were asking sex assigned at birth, they were having to put down something that wasn't them, so they weren't eligible then to be applying to women's colleges. But legal sex is also problematic in like what exactly constitutes legal. Where you were born, where you live has a great deal to do with your ability to change the gender marker on documents. For example, myself, I have changed my driver's license to X as my marker because that's something that they allow in Massachusetts, but I have not been able to change my birth certificate because I was born in a state that doesn't allow you to do that. So what is my legal sex then? So it's problematic because we don't have a standard definition of what constitutes legal sex. And really often we're talking really more about legal gender than about sex. So complicating gender, we refer to gender identity, which is a person's internal sense of themselves. Seems pretty simple, but gender is fluid. So how someone identifies may change over time, may change very readily over time. So how do you capture that? There are hundreds of different gender identity labels. I did a book called The Lives of Transgender People based upon research in the early 2000s, 2005, 2006. At the time, it was the largest study of trans people in the US. It's still the largest study of trans people in the US that was done by individuals as opposed to an organization. Had more than 3,500 people take part in a survey and then did follow-up interviews with a number of them. We had more than 100 different ways that people named their gender. More than 100. And that was 15 years ago. I would hazard to say that today you would get far more than 100. There'd be hundreds of different ways that people name themselves. So it's difficult then to make sense of all that. Many people use multiple labels for their gender. So we need to make sure that we're trying to capture that complexity. And for some trans women, trans men, they want to identify simply as women and men after they transition and not have that trans be part of their identities. And that should be something they can do. But at the same time, we want to be able to, in some places, be able to capture that. So we recognize that they have a different experience than someone who was cisgender. And some people who are non-binary in their gender don't identify as trans, because trans historically has been used to describe trans women, trans men. It's very binary. And so some non-binary folks say that's not really who I am, even though if you look at the definition of trans from a dictionary standpoint, from a linguistic standpoint, it refers to being across from, different from, beyond. So it does work for non-binary people, but some non-binary people don't identify as trans. So how do we make sure we're including them? So my recommendations to try to address some of this complexity, I don't have an easy answer. I don't think anyone really does, because it depends on what your needs are, how you're going to analyze and use the data to determine how you word surveys and word questions and recruitment materials. But some very basic things to keep in mind is not to treat gender as a binary. Very, very basic. Not like that. Be careful of using language that is cis-normative or cis-centric. Saying biological sex, for example, because a lot of trans people see their identities as being biological, or saying genetically. Like, who knows what their genes are, for goodness sake. So that's really problematic. Saying woman, man versus trans woman, trans man is really problematic language, because it basically codes woman and man as being normative, as being cis. It'd be the same thing as saying, oh, I don't know, people and then people of color. So people becomes automatically white. Saying woman and man basically means that you're indicating that really we're talking real men, real women are cis. Use contemporary terminology. And I realize that terminology is always changing. I go back to things I wrote 20 years ago, and I'm embarrassed by some of the language I used, like using the word transsexual. But of course, at that time, that was the language that people used, including people in the community. That's no longer the case for most people. Or 10 years ago, using the word transgender, which now most folks use trans as a more inclusive term. So recognize the terms that are being used in the communities that you are working with, that you're studying, so that you're really not offending people. And of course, there's going to get more people to participate, because if you're using outdated language, people are going to say, oh, this person doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. I'm not going to want to do this, because clearly they don't understand my experience, or not really looking to include my experience. Which brings me to the next point, is involve trans people in the research process. You don't necessarily have to be an expert on all things trans, but certainly involve trans people to be able to understand the trans community better and to be able to make sure that you're being trans inclusive, especially if you're working on things that are really focusing around issues of gender. A question to ask, do you really need to know someone's sex assigned at birth or what their gender marker is on state or federal government documents? Maybe not. Maybe gender identity is all that matters. Because for a lot of trans folks, that is really what matters. Doesn't matter how I was assigned at birth. What matters is who I am. Asking sex assigned at birth, though, can be critical to try to separate individuals who are binary trans, who, if you just give them a choice of women or men, will put that down as their response. And so you don't realize that because you're not asking cis women, cis men will be not differentiated from individuals who are cis. So it can be important to ask that question to get a sense, oh, this person was assigned, let's say, female, but now identifies as male. So it gets put into trans or historically trans category, as opposed to someone who was assigned female and identifies as being female. But I think this can be solved by having a better question to ask gender identity, which I'll be talking about. And never ask a question about sex assigned at birth without also asking gender identity. This is something that for several years I had to push UMass on, because they initially, when more than 10 years now, were asking only sex. I think it was actually sex. I don't even think it was sex assigned at birth, but that was the implication, and not gender identity. And I said, like, what you're telling people is I care about who you are not, rather than who you actually are. So if you're going to be asking sex assigned at birth, if that's a need for research, I suggest including intersex as well with that, recognizing that even though individuals may not be assigned intersex at birth, because most people get put into one or the other camps, and make their best guess that they don't really know. But people who recognize themselves later in life as having intersex variation have a chance then to be able to self-identify and recognize that sex is not a binary, just as gender is not a binary. And recognizing that we are imposing on society a set of terms, categories, when there's a great deal of diversity in people's biological sexual characteristics. If you're going to ask legal sex for whatever reason that might be, this is my suggested wording. You know, again, I mentioned the fact that I have part of my documentation in one gender marker, part in another. So this sort of names that by saying and or. So it would give me a chance then to decide which one better speaks to who I am, which for me would be non-binary, because eventually I'll change my birth certificate once the state that I was born in makes that an option. And you need to have non-binary or X as an option, because legally people can be X. 21 states offer that on driver's license, including Massachusetts, as I mentioned, and 15 states enable that on birth certificates. So that's where we are moving toward. So we need to offer that as an option. And I'm very happy to say that UMass is now doing this. As of last week, we finally got that changed. In asking gender identity, the easiest thing to do is just have an open-ended question, which gives people the chance to really name themselves, which is how, when I did my research on the trans community, large scale study, how we got more than 100, because we gave people the chance to name themselves. And so people came up with some amazing names to describe themselves, things that I had at the time never heard of, that people had come up with as a way to try to capture the complexity of their genders. But I know this is not practical in most cases. And when that's not, and in most of my research, it's not been practical to do that. And it wasn't really practical with the 3,500 people, but at the same time, I thought that was important. And we found ways to code that, to break that down some. If you're gonna give choices, then you make sure you have binary and non-binary options, include questioning or unsure as an option, because people are questioning and unsure oftentimes, and allow for multiple responses because, as I said, people have multiple identities and should be able to name that. And be as inclusive as possible. This is the gender identity question that we now have on our Common App at UMass. This is actually for this coming cycle, which I updated, because one of the things you have to do is, when you are asking questions, is constantly be seeing, is this the right way to ask the question? Are these the most appropriate choices to give? And after we started including gender identity in 2017 on our version of the Common App, and so we have some data over a number of years, so I was able to see, okay, this is really not where people are identifying anymore. So let's change this language to reflect better what the terms are that are being used today. It's important to alphabetize or randomize the choices, so you're not privileging the cisgender categories, which are going to have the most respondents in many cases. You should have a description. Here I put non-trans for individuals who may not understand what cisgender means. We at UMass, for our Common App, we have a glossary, so you can click on and find out what a term means, which is a great educational tool, by the way. I think it really helps for people who are applying to UMass to see that we recognize that all these different gender identity possibilities. And when we started asking the question, we offered more choices than any other college in the country. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but we're certainly up there in terms of giving students as many options as we can for that. But it really serves an educational function, because then people would say, oh, wow, I didn't recognize this was an identity. And I've heard from some students, when they see something and click on it, they say, oh, wow, that's me. I never realized that was me, because they didn't have the terminology. I think that happens less often now than maybe it did 5 years ago, when particularly non-binary identities were not very visible. There weren't very many role models, people in pop culture identifying in various ways as non-binary. But I think it probably still happens that people don't have access to some of this terminology, don't see it in their community. So when they see it on the application, they can learn more about themselves, or at least learn about the trans community and learn about the diversity that's there. I'd also offer a write-in option. That's something that at UMass with our admissions form, we decided not to do, just because it would be just so unwieldy to have that as an option. If that's too many choices, and I recognize that in some cases that is too many choices, I think you need to have at least 6. you need to have cis binary and trans non-binary choices. You need to have cis man, cis woman, trans men. You need to have a non-binary category, and you need to have a questioning or unsure category. And I like this as an option over what you see in the literature often as the two-step approach of asking sex assigned at birth and then gender identity. And this is often how that gets worded. So asking what people had on their original birth certificate, and then asking what they or how they currently identify. The problem that I have with this is what I mentioned earlier, that it's very cis-normative. It treats male and female as being cis male and cis female, when it really should have those adjectives in front of those terms. And if you do that, then you really don't need to be asking assigned at birth, because you're not having to differentiate then between individuals who are now identifying as male or female who started out being assigned something very different. You can recognize individuals who are cis from individuals who are trans. And this is something that I've learned, and you know, because I originally was using this approach in my research, and then got pushback from other trans people who said that's really offensive, and explained to me why it was. And I said, yeah, get it. It is. And of course, at a certain point, people did not know what cis meant. So having cis male, cis female was difficult, because you put that and someone's going to scratch their head and say, where do I fit in this? Because they don't know what that they're cis. Now I think you see that a lot less. And again, you can explain what cis is by, as I did previously in a slide, by saying non-trans, or having a glossary to explain that. And again, it's a good educational tool for people to recognize that you don't have to be cis to identify as male or female. Going back to our work at UMass with the Common App, these are the categories we used to have. And again, I did change them for this next cycle, but these are the ones we had. I'm going to actually open up the chat here and have people indicate, if you would, which identities you think were the most common among individuals who identified as other than cisgender. And again, these are incoming students. I see none of the above. Genderqueer. Questioning. Multiple. Questioning. Multiple. So a real range of different responses folks are giving here. It's been pretty consistently multiple categories and trans men. And I have seen this at other institutions and in the literature in general about who's identifying as trans, at least when they reach college. Some of that does change in college, as particularly for non-binary people, because historically, and again, this is also changing. As I said, there weren't non-binary images, non-binary role models for. So in my research on non-binary folks, I did the first national study of non-binary college students. What I found was that the average age that people identified as being non-binary, and this was like 5 years ago, so I'm sure it's changed since then, it was 18 and a half. So these were students who were not identifying in large part as non-binary until they got to college, until they met non-binary people and had that sort of eureka moment, like, oh, wow, this really describes my experiences, who I am, and never really made sense to me. You know, I never really identified as how I was assigned at birth, but I didn't feel at the opposite or the other extreme. So I just thought, okay, I'm just like, quote unquote, a tomboy, or I'm just a more feminine guy. And it wasn't until they got to college that they sort of put that together and recognized that really better speaks to my experiences identifying as non-binary. So we see a whole lot of students identifying as non-binary once they get to college. But we see here, though, that the multiple categories are pretty much people identifying as non-binary in various ways. So really, non-binary constitutes by far the largest group of folks who are identifying. Very few identifying as trans women because of the stigma associated with identifying as trans women, the level of violence against trans women, the lack of ability for individuals assigned male at birth to really enact any expression role that is not hardcore male. You get shut down, you get mocked, you get violence enacted against you for stepping outside that very narrow male box. So we don't see many students identifying as trans women, or individuals assigned male at birth identifying as non-binary. The non-binary population is heavily skewed to individuals who were assigned female at birth. If sample size is too small for the trans data, you could roll up responses in terms of binary and non-binary trans. For example, this, looking at last year's data on the Common App, this is what I did, I should say, to roll it up. So basically, anyone who chooses one of the non-binary options gets put into a non-binary category. Someone who chooses just a binary option, trans women, trans men in this case, gets put into a binary identity, and then of course having people who are questioning as a separate category. So that's one way to do it. And this is also what we did with the climate survey, the latest one. We use the same categories that we have used on the Common App, and we haven't released the data yet, but this is sort of how we are rolling it up to, again, have trans as a trans woman, trans man as a single binary category, and having a non-binary category as well because of the size of the data. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about like some of the college data, when we have a very small N. It's less an issue here when we're talking about the survey in general, but when we're talking about specific colleges, then it becomes more of an issue because some of the colleges do have very small N's for some of the categories. So it's really important to put the non-binary folks in one category. And in some cases, to put all trans people into one category so that we don't inadvertently out somebody or identify somebody. Another way to code is to put all of the non-binary folks into binary categories. So putting trans men and cis men into a man category, trans women, cis women into a woman category, and then all the various non-binary folks into a non-binary category. And again, having a questioning category as well. That's another way to possibly combine the data if need be. If data has to be reported out as a binary, I think it's still important to give folks the ability to indicate non-binary as an option, but then to randomize how it gets reported out as being a binary. And this is something that UMass agreed to just last week. We've got final approval on doing this because the iPad system, the system that colleges and universities have to report their data to the Department of Education, recognizes gender, unfortunately, as only a binary. And that's been a huge conundrum for us and for a lot of colleges. And it's been sort of the big stumbling block we had to being able to have students be officially known as non-binary on their campus records, because we had to report them out as being M or F. So we couldn't have them being X because we had to provide an M or F. Well, coming around, working the system to be able to randomize by assigning people who are non-binary, female or male, based upon their UMass ID number, enabled us to have a way to work around that. So we could still have people identify as non-binary and report out the data. I've seen other folks do it based upon proportion. So let's say not including the trans non-binary folks, it's, let's say, 59% women, 40% men. You use that percentage to divide up the rest of the folks to put them into a non-binary, put them into a binary category. And I know that really is a form of violence to force someone into a category like that. And I'm actually part of an effort now. I just actually wrote the letter a couple of days ago to try to get the federal government, Department of Education, to change their system. They have made a small change to allow, they have a question now that asks institutions that have non-binary data what that looks like, but it's only one question, and all the other questions in the system are asking data based upon M and F. And so I'm working with national organizations in higher ed and LGBTQ+ organizations to petition, to advocate for that to be changed, so that institutions don't have to force people to be what they're not, to put people into a category that is not who they are. So hopefully that will happen in the next couple of years. I'm optimistic, given the fact that this is where society is going, that more and more folks are identifying as being non-binary. That is the majority of our trans students today are identifying as non-binary. So it's gonna happen in time, because it's hard to fight where people are going, how people are identifying. It's gonna have to be recognized at some point by the federal government. And then some resources to talk about how to be asking questions on gender identity. Most use that two-step gender approach, which again, I personally don't like as an option, but they also, some of them offer other possibilities as well on this. So I'm going to stop screen sharing to give folks a chance to ask some questions and to be able to see folks' faces. So let me do that here. Get rid of my screen. And there you all are. So Michael, you had a question?
Yeah, so there are times when we have to report through to, like, say, federal agencies. I know this is you were just talking about this in your last point with the iPad system. So does it make the most, is it the most appropriate to use a larger questionnaire, like some of the ones that you were showing previously, to to actually aggregate your data. But then if a specific, say, agency that you need to report to is sort of pigeonholing you, to then utilize something along the lines of the iPad. So like because one of the things that run into a problem, and I've run into this in my own work, is that sometimes I have to report and get pigeonholed into those categories.
Sure.
But at the same time, I want to run a research program and a laboratory that is as welcoming to the greater community as possible, and recognizes that is not the reality. The way that I have to report things is not reality.
Right.
So can you give can you speak to that? Because I think there's probably many people that are on this that are probably somewhere along those, stuck in some similar situations.
Yeah, no, I think you named that quite well, that not wanting to pigeonhole people and giving people the ability to identify in the way that best fits them, and then figuring out how to report out that data in a way that suits whatever purposes that needs to be, and recognizing that might be different in different contexts. And I think it's important to say that if you have to report out data as a binary, let's say, that you also indicate to whoever is wanting it that way that your data doesn't fit that, and try to get them to change that, because I think some of it is simply ignorance, right? This is a system we built to collect data this way, or to be asking data this way, and they don't realize that is problematic. You know, just as how we've evolved asking race over the last 30, 40, 50 years to be more inclusive. I think we also need to start getting there when it comes to gender, and educating some of these agencies and third parties. That's been also part of what we are having to do at UMass, because it's not only reporting this data to iPads, it's also giving it to third parties who I can't even name all the folks who have access to that data at UMass, but they oftentimes are collecting it as a binary. And so we have to educate them that, okay, we can give it to you that way, but that's not accurate, because it doesn't reflect this group of folks here who don't identify as male or female.
Yeah, great. That's super helpful.
Susan, you had a question? You're muted. Susan, you're muted.
Sorry. I was just going on and on. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really interesting and helpful. And I'm thinking about the sort of research orientation of a lot of folks here. And I was just trying to think of an example of like using my own research and sort of not really coming up with one. So I wonder if you or anyone else here could give us an example of thinking through those kind of aggregations from a research perspective. Like, when does it make sense to kind of lump, and when does it make sense to split, and when is it important to know you know, those kind of unpreferred labels like sex assigned at birth or legal sex? Like, could you help us think of a research scenario where one would need to know sex assigned at birth, for example, or legal sex, or help us think through a research example where failure to attend to non-binary gender identities is going to actually hamper the research? Okay,
there's a lot of questions.
Does anyone have any examples along these lines that they can offer?
A lot of questions that are there. Certainly when it comes to medical research, knowing sex assigned at birth can be important because of how bodies develop and how tests will function. So they're knowing how someone was assigned at birth, even if they maybe have taken hormones to alter their bodies, there's still ways in which having certain equipment that you were born with is going to make a difference than if it's not theirs. So knowing sex assigned at birth would be important in that kind of a context. In terms of non-binary, well, I'm gonna go to the second question you had about when to lump or aggregate. It really depends upon, I think, the context. You can look and see where the differences in experience. You can look at are there if I do the analysis, are there differences here based upon someone identifying as this gender identity versus that gender identity? And if so, it makes sense to have those be separate variables or separate categories. Also, sample size, I think, comes into play here as well. As I mentioned, we don't want to unintentionally out someone or have someone be able to be identified by having too small an n. So we want to make sure that we are combining to avoid that from happening, or simply not reporting on that data in order to not have that happen. Although if you don't report on it, oftentimes people can do the math themselves and figure out, okay, there are, this many people in the study, and there's, okay, you're missing this many people. So, okay, got it. So I think those are some of the ways to figure out like when to combine categories and when to break or keep categories broken out. In terms of non-binary, I think that it's valuable to have, in order to recognize, like I said, there are often differences that are there based upon experiences, non-binary versus individuals who are trans male, trans female, who are more accepted in some ways in society because they fit into, that what we know how to treat someone who's male, someone who's female. We don't necessarily know how to treat someone who's non-binary. So I think, we can look at those kind of cases and make sense to have that as a separate category when it comes to looking at different experiences. So really, there's no easy answer to this. There's no like one size fits all, right? It all depends upon what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it.
Exactly. Thank you.
I think Mariam has a question.
Yeah, hi. I just had a specific example for Susan that I thought might be helpful, which is we were running a study that was specifically looking at menopause, which is obviously very predicated on sex assigned at birth. And the way that we wound up handling it is in recruitment surveys and materials, we asked the specific question that we needed an answer to, which is, were you assigned female or intersex at birth? And are you undergoing menopause without surgical or drug or hormone intervention, which was our specific criteria. And then for the enrollment data, where we were just sort of looking to collect information about people, we used the like a fill in the blank option for gender, so that we could acknowledge that we're looking for a specific biological category of people to participate in the study, but then also leaving that open to a broader variety of identities for people that might be going through menopause. So
that's a great example. I think also a good way to do it too.
I think Linda has a question.
Well, I've known Genny for a long while. But anyway, the one thing you have to understand is the person that you're talking to is a human being. They have feelings. And the information you get from them is on a need-to-know basis. And That's like right now I'm navigating through the medical department of my insurance since I'm retired, and I'm having to educate them, educate the medical field, the people that I'm talking to, and trying to explain to them that even though I have an M on my medical insurance information, I am a trans female, and that's how they have me listed. And they were concerned as far as whether this is a category they need to put in there. And I said, well, it's on an individual basis. You've got to talk to the people and find out how they identify and different things like this. Now, my assigned birth, yes, trans women do not have, the parts magically disappear. So therefore, I've got to be tested for, several things. I mean, like Jenny was talking about, the doctors, they know how to treat someone that's born male or someone that's born female, but they don't know how to treat someone that's trans. And all it is it's cross hormone, therapy that they need to take to get that information together. Trans woman still has the prostate. Trans male still has a lot of physical insides that they need to understand these differences and combine them together. But main thing is understand the person you're interviewing and you're talking to as a human being. Try and use their name whenever possible. Avoid pronouns. That ticks a person off real easy.
Or be asking what pronouns they use for themselves if it's not something that you know. Yeah, it's so nice to see you, Linda. Linda and I go back 20 years, and wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a really great comment, recognizing that for a lot of trans folks, what they have to keep that original gender marker for health insurance reasons, because you're not going to get covered for pap smear if your insurance says you're M, or prostate exam if it says F. So there are reasons that trans people have different markers on different documents, different things.
Yeah, and thanks, Mary Emma, for that example. That is exactly, the kind of thing I was trying to generate, just because when Jenny was going through the, like all the different questions and all the different ways you can ask the questions, it's easy to kind of get lost in that maze. And I think it's always important, like Linda is saying, to say, why do we need to know this? What is the, what's the research question that is driving our need to ask about, sex and or gender, and then let that, in addition to treating people like humans, but make your research question drive your data collection. Yeah,
Exactly.
One thing that I'll add on to that is that that type of data is also really, really important, because the thing that we will see is that sometimes non-cis individuals, especially in, say, the hot flash type work, which I'm doing as well, is like they have a different experience, and being able to capture that and understand that can really potentially help focus future research to help the people that most need where we most need to place the understanding, and hopefully be able to benefit society in sort of the most direct way. Right. Well, we're getting close to the end. Oh, go ahead, Linda. You have one more?
Yeah, one quick thing. Your information that you're collecting, remember, it's on a need-to-know basis as far as being dispersed out. But your younger generation is what's going to lead this genderqueer communities that you're trying to get research on. It's going to keep changing and changing, because those people don't want to be put into a pigeonhole, but yet they're putting themselves into more pigeonholes that they don't realize until they're there. So just be careful who the information goes out to and what they're going to do with the information once they get it.
Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, I really like what's been done with the UMass Common application, but one of the tricks for me is trying to understand what is the appropriate language at a certain time. As was pointed out, the language changes over time. Is there a resource that is best to determine what language is good for these types of gender identities, so we're using the appropriate language that isn't offensive?
Some of the resources I share at the end talk about suggestions for terminology. And of course, there's no consensus necessarily there either. I included in my slides some of the main terms that folks use, and you can see by looking at studies that include different categories, you can see what categories are the most common. And again, it's going to vary by what discipline or what kind of research you're doing, where you might need having some categories that someone else may not need to have that sort of differentiation in categories. So again, there's not a one size fits all, but certainly there are main categories that people use, trans man, trans woman, non-binary as a catch-all, and some people use non-binary as civic identity, gender fluid, gender queer, agender. Those are the main ones that are out there today. Tomorrow will be different, no doubt, but those are the ones that are most common that I see and how people identify.
All right, thanks.
I even talked about sexuality at all today, and that's a whole thing in itself. We have for our Common App, we have 9 different choices for gender identity, as well as none of the above, and you can mark more than one. And I don't know, stats are never I'm more of a qualitative than I don't do much with quantitative, so I don't know what the math there is for 9 different choices, and you can choose as many as you want. It's a couple hundred, I think, but we have the same for sexuality. We have 9 different choices, and you can mark more than one. So very robust.
So, Mark, one of the resources that I found really helpful, I just dropped into the link. It's actually through the Stonewall Center, through some of their training. They have a few handouts that I think was, at least for me, was a good place to start.
Oh, thank you for saying that and for pointing that out. Yeah, and one of those is the handout we use, because as I said, for the Common App, we give people a chance to click on a link to define terms, and one of those is that link for people. So it has like the very basic terms, and then one more robust. I'm working on a book right now on LGBTQ plus college students, and it's been, let's just say, a very lengthy process to try to write this thing, because it's trying to look at research over the past 40 years on LGBTQ plus college students. There's a lot there to try to sift through and indicate what the most important research is. But part of it, I have this chart of terminology, because I want people reading the book to know, like, what is the main terminology that gets used by people today, younger people today. And I swear I've changed that chart like 6 times in the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, because terminology keeps changing. Mostly new words get added. I see a word being picked up and usually it's mostly around non-binary sexuality, non-binary gender. Young people, can put something on social media and it gets out there. Some people resonate to it and say, oh, that really works for me, and they start using it, or maybe people see it and say, oh, that's a really good term. We don't have a term for this. So then it becomes something that gets widely used. And so I want to recognize that. So yeah, it's hard to keep up with for sure.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank Jenny for her time and effort. It's been fantastic to have you. I hope that we're able to keep the dialogue going.
Yeah, feel free to, if you have questions as you're developing surveys or research or what have you, let me know if I can be of assistance, you know, in helping to word questions and such. Like I said, there is not a one size fits all, so it's really going to vary. And I'm certainly willing to put my 2 cents, and I'm always willing to tell people what they should do. So feel free to reach out to me if I can be of assistance.
Fantastic. And if there's anybody that is on the call that is interested in having further seminars and things in this type of area, feel free to reach out to me or to Jenny. The group that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we were talking about how this can be a start of a conversation and how we can maybe have it go in some specific different directions, maybe some towards the social sciences, some towards the more biomedical sciences and things like that, where maybe we can develop resources and things like that that can support researchers in that way. I know for myself, this has been something over the last couple of years that has been just trying to educate myself on things. And I found that oftentimes in the biomedical sciences, it's challenging to find resources on how to implement best practices. So we've tried to do what we think is a best effort. And I feel like it changes every time that we put in a new study. So the thought process is definitely evolving. And the more people I think that we can think about it, the better off that we'll all be in hopefully moving research forward, but also moving research forward in a way that is inclusive to our community. So. Great. Thank you so much.